You're listening to Think on KERA 90.1. I'm Chris Boyd. Are today's deeply involved mothers and fathers setting their children up to be weak, dependent, and demanding? When we look back at our own childhoods, most adults today don't recall being raised by so-called helicopter parents, and there has been plenty of ink spilled criticizing U.S. moms and dads for overdoing the praise and even the attention they lavish on their kids. But when he looked for actual evidence that contemporary parenting practices are detrimental to child development, my guest today came away convinced that many of us are doing a better job than we thought. The new book by author and lecturer Alfie Kohn is called The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging Conventional Wisdom About Childhood and Parenting. Alfie, welcome back to Think.
Thank you.
So what kinds of criticisms were you hearing that made you want to look into this question of whether we are spoiling a whole generation of American children?
Oh, there's a cluster of them that we hear, and some of them are kind of hard to reconcile with one another. On the one hand, we're told that parents are too permissive, failing to set limits and properly discipline their children. On the other hand, we're told that parents are overprotective, and they're, as you say, helicopter parents. I don't understand how both can be true. But at the same time, we also hear that kids are spoiled, entitled, narcissistic, that they have inflated self-esteem, they're unready for the rigors of the real world, and that they get everything too easily, from stickers to praise to trophies to grades and so on. And what I tend to do for a living is to look at common beliefs and see if the evidence actually supports them. And in this case, what really grabbed my attention is that these are deeply conservative assumptions, apart from what turns out to be an almost complete absence of any supporting evidence. And yet, these assumptions have been accepted uncritically even by people who aren't terribly conservative in terms of their political beliefs. And so I found that puzzling, and I wanted to lay out in the book what the evidence actually says and what the ideology is driving all those complaints.
Well, it turns out that people have been sneering at kids today for hundreds of years.
Yes, absolutely. In the first chapter, I give the usual complaints about kids being spoiled and ill-mannered and thinking that they can get anything they want, feeling entitled, and that parents don't discipline properly, unlike the good old days of a few decades ago. So then I go back a couple of decades and find exactly the same thing being said, and then a few decades before that, and so on. You know, when you put it in historical perspective and say there's zero evidence of, say, permissiveness as a common parenting approach today compared to other parenting approaches, there's certainly no evidence to show it's more so today than it used to be. And when you see that people have been bellyaching about this for decades, if not centuries, then the people with this sort of aggressive nostalgia ought to sit down and shut up.
What do we mean when we call a child spoiled anyway? Is it overindulged? Is it ungrateful? Is it just downright bratty?
The sloppiness and lack of precision with which that and other terms are used is part of the problem. I think we can distinguish between spoiled in the sense of getting too many material goods, which is not my primary focus in the myth of the spoiled child. And then there's that sort of constellation of other complaints and synonyms like the ones you just offered, where people aren't very precise about it, which makes it doubly hard to know how pervasive the problem really is. But really, when people complain that kids today are spoiled or manipulative or think they're entitled to stuff, it tends to say more about the person offering the complaint than it does about the children about whom these complaints are directed.
Well, it's interesting, too, Alfie, because parenting concerns and criticisms, we sort of look at the kids, but what we're really doing is looking at other parents, right, and saying that they're doing a bad job.
That's right. The behaviors that our neighbors engage in with their children seem to us to be indulgent. They're coddling their kids and so on, and not setting a firm line and letting kids experience what they need to on their own. But the very same behaviors that we engage in are innocuous, if not downright loving sometimes. So a lot has to do with the fact that a lot of Americans just don't like children very much, especially children other than their own, and think they should just shut up and be seen and not heard. And a really disparaging approach to children, especially teenagers, and now young adults, again, under the heading of millennials, drives a lot of the social criticism. But this doesn't mean that I'm giving parents a pass and saying that mainstream parenting is actually constructive and appropriate. I don't think that. My concerns come from the other direction. I think that parents are so worried about being tagged as permissive that they tend to overcompensate by being over-controlling and thereby extending what has done so much harm to generations, which is an approach I call doing-to parenting, using rewards and punishments and a kind of top-down approach that's profoundly disrespectful of children to make them comply with adult authority, as opposed to a working with approach that is not only more humane but tends to work a lot better. So we end up perpetuating different versions of that same emphasis on obedience that I think has bedeviled generations of children, and yet astonishingly complain that the problem is the opposite, that kids are indulged.
I thought it was fascinating that you put punishment and reward in the same category of to be used only with extreme caution.
Oh, sure. They're two sides of the same coin. If a punishment says to kids, do this, or here's what I'm going to do to you, and it leads children to ask, what do they want me to do, and what happens to me if I don't do it? Rewards say to kids, do this, and I'll give you that. And the question that elicits is not so different. It's what do they want me to do, and what do I get for doing it? Both are based on control. It's just that in the case of rewards, it's sugar-coated control. Both are ways of doing things to kids to make them comply, rather than ways of working with kids to help them become moral, happy, compassionate, responsible people. And both, according to a long line of psychological research, tend to be counterproductive, because when kids do something in order to get a reward, including praise, or to avoid a punishment, which we euphemistically call a consequence, kids have no commitment to the underlying action or value, because they're just acting in order to avoid the threat or secure the bribe.
So for parents who are listening to this and saying, okay, well, how do I make my child inherently desire to make his or her bed every morning? I mean, would you say, is it that important that the bed gets made? Is that how we look at this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I never understood why beds had to be made. And I think we can put a lot of other things in that category, too. Mm-hmm. But I think the first step for a responsible parent is to say, if my kid is not doing what I'm telling her to do, the first thing I should do is not accuse the kid of being disobedient or a problem kid and look for cleverer or tougher forms of control, but to ask whether it may be that the thing we're asking the child to do is developmentally inappropriate or purely for our own convenience and not for the child's well-being. You know, the vast range of parenting books and articles and seminars out there really start from the question, how do I get my kid to do whatever I want? Whereas a book I wrote a few years ago called Unconditional Parenting and a handful of other great books written by other authors begin with the question, what do kids need and how can we meet those needs? And it almost doesn't even matter how you answer those respective questions. What matters more is which of those questions is driving what you're doing. And I think there's a close connection between that push for tighter control and more compliance and the beliefs that I try to unpack and look at carefully in this book, the conservative war on self-esteem, the drive, the call for more grit and self-discipline on the part of children, are all based on getting kids to comply. And the result is kids who take orders from other people, and sometimes they end up taking orders and directions from their peers when we don't think those are appropriate guidelines. You know, there's another parenting author once said, summarized a complaint of a parent who said, "What happened to my wonderful little boy who did everything I told him to do, and now he's a teenager, and look at how he talks and what he eats and what he wears, and oh my God, what happened?" And the response was, "Nothing happened. You raised him to do what he was told." And that's what he's still doing. It's just that now other people are doing the telling.
Why do you characterize this scorn for so-called overparenting as an inherently conservative phenomenon if you find that liberals are doing it too?
Well, in some of the book, I call it traditionalist. I don't know if that's the right label, but it comes, I think, from a very dark view of human nature and of children, an emphasis on self-sufficiency and self-control, that basically what you are is bad and you have to learn to ride herd on yourself so that you can conform to social norms. It comes from a strong belief not only in competition, that the point is not excellence, but defeating other people who are trying to do what you're doing. And above all, a commitment to conditionality. And it took me a while to figure that last one out. But, you know, if you point out to people, so the losing team, you know, got a little trinket that said, "Thanks for playing," it drives the conservatives bananas, you know. But if they think they can get a trophy even when they don't win, they won't be prepared for real life where everybody doesn't get a trophy. You know, they become apoplectic about this. And you say, there's no evidence at all, ever, of any harm of this kind. And the kids know who won the game anyway.
Yeah.
So if they're not being misled, how could they possibly be adversely affected in terms of difficult or competitive situations they come across later? Besides, this whole notion that the best way to prepare kids for miserable experiences they're going to have later is to make them miserable now has no psychological validity at all. So you point out there's no empirical backing, and then they pivot, and they say, in effect, "But they lost. They're not supposed to get a trophy." And that's when you realize that all the talk that was descriptive or predictive was really a fig leaf covering an ideological commitment that says you got to earn everything you get. Kids are getting A's too easily. We're praising them without there being impressive in their accomplishments enough to earn the good job. This notion is like where the law of the marketplace meets sermons about what you have to do to earn your way into heaven, where every human interaction, even in a family, has to be like an economic transaction. So that whole approach, this whole mindset, is what I'm calling conservative in its premises, but it also turns out to be quite politically conservative in its consequences by saying, in effect, that we shouldn't look at larger structural issues that drive how people act. It's all a matter of individual responsibility. And I talk about that in the later chapters, how we really need to ask, is our goal to raise kids who do whatever they're told in life, or is it to raise reflective rebels who question and try to make our society better?
Alfie Kohn is my guest. His new book is called The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging Conventional Wisdom About Childhood and Parenting. You can join us now by calling in to 1-800-933-5372, or you can send email to think@kera.org.
Funding for Think comes from the SMU Certificate Program in Financial Planning with classroom instruction, a CFP board-registered curriculum, and flexible class schedules. Applications accepted now for the program, which begins March 31st. smu.edu/CPFP.
You're listening to Think on KERA 90.1. I'm Chris Boyd. We're speaking this hour with education writer Alfie Kohn. His new book is called The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging Conventional Wisdom About Childhood and Parenting. Join the discussion by calling in to 1-800-933-5372. Send email to think@kera.org or send me a tweet at Chris Boyd Think. So, Alfie, you actually looked into the data about so-called helicopter parenting. First of all, what does the term really mean, and how often is it truly applicable?
There's been no research until just the last few years, so all of the articles excoriating parents for being helicopter parents have and continue to be, frankly, based on selective anecdotes, if you read carefully, not actual research. The term is usually applied to parents who hover too close, hence the term helicopter parenting, and get too involved in their children's lives and solving their problems for them, even when the kids have gone away to college and become young adults. So when you actually look at the research carefully, you find the following. One, it's actually pretty rare. Every study I've seen, even those from people who are trying to show it's bad, cannot find many examples of it, despite the colorful anecdotes in magazine articles. Two, it actually can be productive and helpful. And a study of about 9,000 students in colleges across the country a few years ago found that those whose parents were really closely involved in their lives, enough to make a lot of people uncomfortable, were faring better than their peers on all kinds of emotional and academic measures, which I think is very interesting. The third thing I'd point out is that when helicopter parenting does seem to be unfortunate, even pathological in its implications, when the parents are really getting too involved, it's not because they're indulgent or coddling their kids or cushioning them. It's because the parents are too controlling and doing so out of their own need to have the kids need them. So in effect, what's wrong with helicopter parenting when it isn't useful or constructive is an extension of what's been wrong for decades, which is parents' tendency to over-control kids. And the last thing you find when you look at the research is the effects aren't uniform across class, race, ethnicity, gender. When people condemn helicopter parenting, they tend to do it with a very broad brush. But a lot depends on whether you've been raised to value independence or interdependence. If it's the latter, it may not be a good thing to be pushed out and say, now make it on your own. And especially young adults who are the first in their families to go to college tend to need a lot more support. And so our relentless promotion of independence as a value in this culture turns out to be very ill-suited to an awful lot of young adults.
I guess the thing a lot of people worry about, Alfie, is these kids who end up dependent on their parents even into adulthood. You point out the fact that evidence that young adults are talking to their parents more and in contact more doesn't necessarily mean that they continue to rely on mom and dad to solve every problem.
No, that's absolutely right. There's a big difference between how often parents and their young adult children are in contact, how often they talk to each other or text each other, and whether the parents are taking over their lives for them, which often doesn't follow. I'm aware of only one good study of adults in their 20s, and it turned out that even those who still lived with their parents were not necessarily more dependent or saw themselves as less mature and so on. That's a fear based on our individualist ideology in our culture that isn't always borne out by the data, particularly when you look at larger social and economic conditions now. The fact that people are having children and getting married later in life, and many of them are still young adults are really struggling economically to pay off horrendous loans and having trouble finding jobs. So in many cases, it's adaptive and appropriate. The far greater risk to children's mental health at all ages is lack of adequate support and unconditional acceptance by their parents. It really says something about our culture that you can't pick up a magazine without hearing another condemnation of too much support, which, again, like the condemnations of spoiling, I think says more about the people making that charge than about what's really happening out there.
So you worry that this sort of tiger mom expectation of high performance from kids that is encouraged by some parents gives kids the message that they are loved if and only if they achieve what the parents believe to be important.
Yes, that's like the reductio ad absurdum of conditional parenting, which is bad even when it's not quite that extreme and pathological. What kids need is not just to be loved, but to be loved for who they are, not for what they do. And one of the most destructive things that parents can do is let kids conclude, even if we didn't really mean for this to happen, but to cause them to infer that I have to be well-behaved or I have to be impressive at school or in sports. I have to jump through hoops in order to win my parents' attention and acknowledgement and approval and love. That kind of conditional parenting has been shown in study after study to screw kids up in all kinds of ways. And it doesn't really even matter what the love is conditional on. It can be on being nice and hiding your anger and sadness, or it can be on getting A's in school, or being funny, or thin and pretty. Whatever it is, when conditions are attached as the kids see it, which is more important than how we, the parents, see it, that tends to undermine mental health. And that is so ironic because, as I pointed out before the break, the sort of traditionalist critique of parenting is that kids don't have to work hard enough to get stuff, including, our love or our expressions of acknowledgement or their own self-esteem. The kind of self-esteem that turns out to be a marker for mental health is not just self-esteem that's high, but self-esteem that's unconditional, which means that kids have a basic core of faith in themselves that even when they screw up or fall short, they know they're good people. And that's the unconditionality that drives, I think, many social conservatives, including people who never even acknowledged being social conservatives, to the point of just turning red and purple in the face. They think you have to earn your good feelings about yourself. And turns out that's what undercuts healthy development.
Let's go to the phones now at 1-800-933-5372. We have Al on the line in Dallas. Hi, Al.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to say I'm a long-time listener of your show, and I really appreciate the excellent job I feel you do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I missed your guest's name, but...
Alfie Kohn.
I'm sorry, say again?
Alfie Kohn.
Kohn.
Mr. Kohn. There's a few things that were said, and it leads me to this question. I'll ask the question first, and then I'll tell you why I asked the question based on what I heard on the interview. The question is, isn't there some defense to be made for making, your kids do chores, say that they wouldn't otherwise want to do without the carrot or the stick of the reward or the punishment?
What do you think about that, Alfie?
I think sometimes it's nice to have kids help out around the house, but I also think that getting the chores done takes a back seat to our long-term goals for kids. We want them. I'm not willing to rupture or strain my relationship with my kids, the way they look at me, the extent to which they feel trusted and included in decision-making, just in order to get them to load the dishwasher or make the beds, assuming that's important to you. So I would want them to want to help out. And if I just pressure them to do it or reward them for doing it or punish them for not doing it, I can buy one thing with rewards and punishments, which is temporary compliance, but at a large cost. And I'm not sure I'm willing to pay that cost.
Let me ask you this, Alfie, because, I don't want to load the dishwasher or make the beds. and I'm 43 years old. So do we need to just assume that at some point our kids will grow up and they will recognize that these things have to be done one way or another, and whether they like it or not, they will become responsible adults, even if we don't sort of encourage this behavior at home?
Yes, if we're talking narrowly about having to sweep or clean the toilet or wash the dishes eventually when they're in their own place, they'll see those things don't get done by themselves.
Right.
But I think our main job as parents is not just to say, I got to prepare you for unpleasant stuff by making you do unpleasant stuff now. It's to cultivate a sense of warmth and connection and concern about other people, and to say, boy, it would really help me out given that I have to make dinner if you could feed the dog, or whatever it is. And so the reason for doing it is not because I said so or because you're going to have to do it later when you're living on your own, but because it helps me out the way I help you out, and we're a family. And I think for most kids, most of the time, by putting that sense of connection and other-orientedness as our main concern, well above following the rules or doing the chores, we're able to help kids grow up to be people who are caring, and that matters more than having clean dishes.
1-800-933-5372 is our telephone number. Let's go next on the phone to Glenn in Fort Worth. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I coach Little League basketball, and I just the way your guest put this notion of learning how to, well, with respect to youth athletics, I do see value in learning how to lose with dignity. Seems like our youth athletics are going in one of two directions. You either have these really ultra-competitive leagues that, parents are taking their kids to practice at 6, 7, 8, and 9 years old every day, playing multiple games on the weekend, extremely competitive, to leagues that, nobody keeps score, and it's just real, very not competitive at all.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a happy medium, Alfie?
I don't agree with the way this has been framed, which leads naturally to we need a happy medium. I would say that the idea that we can have fun and hang out with other people we like and get some exercise and fresh air and learn to cooperate, that's what recreation ought to be about. And so the less we're set against other kids to learn the message that we can succeed only if they fail, the better. In fact, I'll take it a step further. There are actually dozens of really fun games for kids that are not competitive at all, where everyone on the field is working strategically and happily to reach a common goal. So it's not us against them or me against you. That was a book I wrote many years ago called No Contest, The Case Against Competition, which I know is heresy, especially in places like Texas, but throughout America. The idea that it may be more productive and more psychologically healthy and better for our relationship with others and just more enjoyable to engage in activities that are more cooperative. And when you show the evidence to folks that this is really true, that you really don't need to compete at all in order to meet any of the advantages that people think are desirable, they tend to come back by saying, but it's a competitive world out there, and we're back to the same sort of better get used to it mentality. People are going to, it's like that Monty Python sketch called Getting Hit on the Head Lessons, where the guy walks in and is slammed on the head and doesn't understand why, and he's taught how to get hit on the head, because that's excellent preparation for being hit on the head later. The other thing that's ideological and I think really interesting about this is that we have this tendency to assume that competition or competitiveness is the same as excellence, when in fact they're not only different theoretically, but often tend to pull in opposite directions. Yet we build into the notion of excellence the idea that there have to be losers, that if you create a situation in a classroom or on a playing field or in a workplace where everyone benefits by working together, that's called mediocrity, because we didn't have losers. And it's really interesting to pick apart this really uncritically received idea that we have to be beating each other in order to succeed, which turns out not to be true.
Somebody gave my middle school age kids a collaborative board game this year for Christmas. And
oh, yeah, I love this.
I'd never seen one before, and it turned out to be a surprisingly fun time. Everybody is essentially working as a team, and you do win or lose, but you win or lose all together.
You succeed or fail. It's
succeed
not really
or fail.
All right.
Losing.
That's right. You succeed together or you fail together. There's no winning or losing. And that's the point. Success doesn't entail winning. And if there are some benefits to failing, which I think tends to be overrated, it doesn't ever require losing in a competitive situation. If you go to cooperativegames.com, they've got loads of them, board games for all ages, which are really fun for little kids and really challenging for older kids and adults. And the point is, until you've played cooperative games, you don't really understand how much fun competition isn't.
Let's go back to the phones now. This time we have Marvin on the line in Fort Worth. Hey, Marvin.
Oh, how you doing? Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm especially interested in what your guest is saying, and kind of I think the thing that I'm a little concerned about, as a parent of two young children, is there is sort of a need for teaching compliance with social norms to a degree. I think most people would agree with that. And both my kids are young right now, and what he was saying about the rewards and punishments is really kind of striking to me because my daughter is 16 months old. I don't see how you could rationalize with her, explain, the need and the motivation behind things without using rewards and punishment. So if he could kind of speak to how he envisions that working with a 1 or 2 or 3-year-old, that would be good.
Thanks, Marvin. You know what? We're going to take a quick break. So, Alfie, hold on to your answer, and we'll get it in just a moment. My guest is Alfie Kohn, author of the new book, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging Conventional Wisdom About Childhood and Parenting. Join the conversation by calling 1-800-933-5372. Send me a tweet at Chris Boyd Think, or send email to think@kera.org.
Funding for Think comes from the SMU Certificate Program in Financial Planning with classroom instruction, a CFP board-registered curriculum, and flexible class schedules. Applications accepted now for the program, which begins March 31st. smu.edu/CPFP.
You're listening to Think on KERA 90.1. I'm Chris Boyd. We're speaking this hour with education writer Alfie Kohn, author of the new book, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging Conventional Wisdom About Childhood and Parenting. Join us at 1-800-933-5372. And Alfie, that's where we heard from Marvin before the break, who has, I guess, sounds like preschool-age kids, and wanted to know how to teach them things that sort of just allow them to get along in society without using rewards and punishments.
Well, the premise of the question is that getting along and being socialized to do what they're told should be our primary goal, or at least a major goal. And I would begin by raising a question about how that goal compares with and comports with other goals we may have for kids. For example, to make sense of the world, to know that they're loved, to think critically and creatively about things they come across. And sometimes if those other goals clash with getting kids to do what we want them to do, we might not necessarily always want to vote for the latter. But to the extent we want to have kids understand what's going on without bribing or threatening them into obedience, which, again, as I said earlier, doesn't help kids develop a commitment to the things we want them to do. It just gets them thinking, what do I have to do to get the reward or avoid the punishment? So what we can do is explain the reason for something and fit that language to their ability to understand. You know, even a kid who's not even 2 years old can be told, you know, the cars come by this in the street very fast, and they can hurt you if they hit you, and I love you too much to let that happen. Where do you think you could play instead that would be safer? I mean, that treats a child, even a very young child, like a human being, and ends by giving the child some control by making a decision. Instead of hitting the kid when the kid rushes out into the street, which doesn't teach that streets can be unsafe, it teaches that mommy or daddy should be feared. And another thing we can do to help induct kids into a society is simply to set an example, to model helping or apologizing rather than making them apologize when they're not sorry, which teaches them basically to lie, to show what it means to be compassionate, to show what it means to be excited about the stuff we do at work instead of complaining about it, to be generous to strangers, not, again, by manipulating kids with carrots and sticks, but by using love and reason.
We have an email here from John who asks if you've got kids, and if so, how old they are.
If I have kids?
Yeah.
Yep, I have two. They're 18 and 14.
So you are almost past the scary time, right?
Well, no, there's new levels of scariness with older kids. But the point is I've been through it. Mm-hmm. I find when people ask me that question, they're not so much curious as hoping to find something personally that they can use to discredit the ideas that they find challenging. But yes,
why do you think people,
I have been through it myself.
Excuse me for interrupting. Why do you think people find these ideas so challenging?
Oh, I think that's a question that answers itself, don't you? I think any of your callers could indicate this. It means that we have, number one, that it takes talent and time and care and, above all, courage to work with kids to solve problems together. It takes no talent or time or care or courage to reward or punish kids into obeying us. To give up control is always hard when you have it relative to other people. It's hard for managers with employees, teachers with students, and above all, parents with kids. It means trusting, and a lot of us have been brought up to believe the worst about people, and especially about children. We think they can't be trusted. They have to be monitored and tightly regulated. That's frightening. And above all, it's terrifying, because if what I'm saying is true, it doesn't just raise troubling questions about what we may have been doing to our children, but what may have been done to us when we were children.
1-800-933-5372 is our number. We have Chandra on the line now in Irving. Hi, Chandra.
Hi. Actually, thanks for taking my call. I had a question about advice on if you are a young adult and your parents were raising you the old school way, the very traditional way. Mm-hmm. How can you make sure that you don't do that to your children? And then the other side of that is, how do you deal with your parents that think that same way, and you're having to work on your relationship with that?
Interesting question. Thanks for your call.
Well, the best answer to the latter question about raising these issues gently with one's own parents is, of course, to get them a copy of The Myth of the Spoiled Child and then talk about it together. I say this tongue-in-cheek, of course. But to raise issues about this, I don't know how best to do it or when best to do it or whether it would be unsettling, because I don't know you and I don't know your parents. But in terms of making sure that you don't reproduce the kind of top-down authoritarian parenting, the very fact that you would ask that question is, I think, a very encouraging sign that you're already on the way to reflecting critically about these issues rather than mindlessly reproducing old-school parenting techniques saying, well, that's just the way I was raised, and instead saying, maybe I can separate out the stuff my parents did that I think was constructive and loving and useful and just take those things when I raise my own child instead of pulling the whole thing forward into a different generation.
And that is sort of what every generation does, isn't it? I mean, to an extent, maybe there are things that we reproduce that are not the most helpful, but it does seem that each subsequent generation approaches parenting in a slightly different way.
You know, I don't know if that's true because I haven't seen data one generation to the next in terms of attitudes. It may be that things are getting better, at least as I would define better, in some respects, but an awful lot of control really is just kicked forward into the next generation. And sometimes current parents congratulate themselves because they use praise with kids. Good job, honey. I really like the way you wiped your feet by yourself, instead of spanking their kids the way their parents did. But I think the deeper question is, aren't we still too focused on getting compliance, on getting kids to do what they're told, instead of asking broader questions about how we help kids to be responsible and caring and morally sophisticated and happy? It may just be that we've substituted one technique for getting control for another. I'd like to think we're moving forward, and that we're questioning, above all, questioning social norms, assumption about what's polite, which is often based on superstition, political beliefs, child care strategies, that we're willing to take them apart and not just say, because that's the way it's done, because that's just the way life is, we have to continue doing stuff that doesn't make sense. That's a message that runs through, I hope, all my books, right up through it, including this one, is that we have to be willing to ask challenging questions, not just raise our kids to obey rules, but raise our kids to be critical thinkers who look at rules and say, are these worth obeying and why?
1-800-933-5372 is our telephone number. We have Erica on the line now in Dallas. Hey, Erica. Erica, are you with us?
Hello.
Hi, go right ahead, please.
Sorry.
All right, Erica, we will move on here. We have a question, from Lata, who says, I wanted to know if all competitions are bad. Even if you tell your kids it only matters if they do their best, it doesn't matter if you win.
Well, I don't expect that most or even many listeners will agree with me on this, a topic that I've been studying for some 30 years. But I'm still looking for evidence that it ever is necessary or desirable to set people against each other so that one can succeed only by making others fail. At work, at school, at home, or at play. I tend to believe that competition is best when it's minimized or transcended altogether. And in our society, where competition is practically our state religion, that's regarded as heresy. But I would invite people to question, again, in this case, what we've all been raised to assume is that everybody has to try to be a winner, which means that we have to make other people losers. When you look at the most effective ways, for example, for kids to learn in a classroom, it tends to be to have kids cooperate, working and learning together in groups so that they succeed or fail together. And they end up learning and acquiring far more intellectually useful strategies, as well as benefiting in terms of how they feel about themselves and how they feel about and work with others when there's zero competition. When you introduce competition, awards, assemblies, and spelling bees, and you can't even show your prowess with math or singing unless it's at someone else's expense. The amazing thing is everybody tends to lose in a competitive encounter. And so often I'm hit with the notion that it's mediocrity if we don't have awards and recognize the outstanding students. But exactly the opposite turns out to be true, because what really promotes excellence is a caring community where kids look at one another as potential allies rather than as potential obstacles to their own success.
Let's go next on the phone to Brandon in Athens. Hey, Brandon.
Hello?
Hi, Brandon. Go right ahead, please.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Sure.
I enjoy your program very much. I'm listening to your guest's really interesting remarks, and he reminds me of the time I read George Lakoff's Moral Politics. The nurturant parent versus the gendered term, the strict father. And I would wonder, would your guest identify as a care ethicist? And I'll take my answer off the phone. Thank you.
I missed the last couple.
I did too. Brandon,
words.
Are you still with us?
Well, if he's asking about George Lakoff's book Moral Politics, as a matter of fact, my new book, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, begins with a story that Lakoff tells in his book. And the story that he tells is about when he was out in his garden talking to a friend of his, and he asked his friend, is there a single question that you could ask somebody, and on the basis of that one answer predict their political views on anything from abortion to gun control to foreign policy? And his friend said, sure. Ask him, when your child cries at night, do you pick him up? And I found that fascinating, and I find Lakoff's notions that the caller just mentioned of dividing people into the strict father morality and the nurturing parent morality to be very compelling. But as I started the hour by saying, the one problem with Lakoff's notion, and especially with that interesting question, is that even people who are not politically conservative tend to accept very conservative assumptions about children and parenting.
Let me end with this, Alfie. So many times people think about parenting as being an instinct, but it seems that many parents are dealing with competing instincts within themselves. On the one hand, you want everything for your child and everything to be perfect for your child. On the other hand, many people have this instinct to, as you say, repeat the way they were raised or make their children behave a certain way. What do we do about that, and how much can we trust our own instincts?
Well, I think we have to rise above what is instinctive or habitual or unreflective. Some of our instinctive, predilections, the extent to which, a child is crying and we want to comfort that child, that's a good instinct we should act on. But a lot of other stuff is sort of swallowed whole or introjected. It's inside us without us having figured out whether it makes sense or where it came from. And so I'm not suggesting we become robotic, that we merely act on what data says without any connection to our own emotional responses. But I also think neither can we just say, go with your gut, because our gut has been formed in a very particular society that has very particular assumptions about children, about the value of obedience, about the value of competition, and I think all those things are worth reflecting on. What I'm trying to do in my books and presentations, and I know a lot of other people are trying to do too, is to call us back to our better instincts, the ones that really help our kids to become the kind of people we know they can be.
The new book by author and lecturer Alfie Kohn is called The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging Conventional Wisdom About Childhood and Parenting. Alfie, a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Think is produced by Stephen Becker and engineered by Shelley Kanabe. Lindsay Connect is our assistant producer with help today on the phones from Gus Contreras. Our executive producer is Jeff Whittington. You can find me on Twitter at Chris Boyd Think, and you can email the show at think@kera.org. Once again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening and have a great day.